Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Spring Season. Climate change is a unifying crisis of our time, but the scale of the problem can be paralyzing. Despite very clear science and very real devastation, it feels like we're still just talking about it. Something has to change, but what and how? My guest tonight is Malcolm Harris, author of, among other things, the national bestseller Palo Alto, A History of California, which I loved. In his new book, What's Left? 3 Paths Through the Planetary Crisis, he lays out a compelling strategy for saving the world. Just as humans have caused climate change, we hold the power to stop and perhaps reverse it. But that will only happen through collective political action. How can we ensure that we can move forward together rather than endlessly discussing potential solutions? Tonight, we're going to be talking about where we stand and how we got here and the path toward a brighter future. Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Malcolm.
We're so glad to have you back in California. What do you miss the most about being in California?
Oh, the weather.
Oh, I can imagine.
I mean, the people. Yeah.
That's right,
the
all
weather.
our friends. Oh, that's great. You know, it was Easter Sunday on Sunday, and so I told 3,000 people about your book.
Yes.
And I told them, and I described it in this way. I said, you know, here we have these fossil fuels that are still in the ground, and we know that if we burned them all, that it would really lead to the destruction of our climate. So, you know, what do we do about that problem? How do we move forward? So it was like kind of one sentence, but how would you kind of fill that out in describing, you know, the problem that we face?
Yeah, I mean, the concept for this book really emerged from a conversation I had with a Shell oil analyst when I was asking him about what happens to a well once Shell decides to decarbonize it, because Shell feels compelled to decarbonize some of its assets, as many oil companies do. And he told me that they don't shut down that well, they sell it to someone else who's going to operate it at a lower cost by evading labor restrictions, by evading environmental restrictions. And so this decarbonization effort, in fact, increases the intensity of carbonization, which really gets to this question of, well, what are we doing here? Are we actually decarbonizing? And what would real decarbonization look like if that's not what it is? If we can't wrest control of what we're actually doing away from what look like inhuman processes that are destroying the conditions for habitability on this planet?
Yeah, that was a very powerful story. And I remember just from my own, when I was a management consultant, being in situations like that with just, you know, impossible immoral problems. You talk about the social metabolism. Could you describe what that is? I think it might be helpful for people to just have that be part of the tools in our understanding of how the world works.
Absolutely. It's a really useful concept, I think, and it's one that made this book make sense to me. And the idea is that we think of where we live and the society in which we live as a mode of production, where it produces things mainly. But there are other cycles that are just as important to production as far as we are concerned as living beings. Reproduction, waste, maintenance, these are all cycles that we pay less attention to than production because of the mode of production we live in right now. But if we take a social metabolic view, that says these other processes are just as important as production and just as much need to be a focus of our reform efforts, of our awareness of what we're doing, and of our climate solutions.
Yeah, and that's what I appreciated very much, is just to really look at those base causes in a new and fresh way, because we are so formed by our capitalist environment that's hard for us to see anything other than, you know, the inputs in and production out, and to measure through the national income statistics, to try to measure society's well-being in those ways.
And even just the accumulation of stuff, and this is a strong political tendency right now. You're hearing a lot about like abundance. We just need to build more and more things, and then that will solve our political and social problems. And I don't think that's the case. I think we have to look at this from a social metabolic perspective, where we really do think like how we're dealing with waste is just as important as production. Carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is waste, and we have a hard time seeing that and understanding that we have a waste management problem.
Yeah, and what I liked about that so much, that way of conceptualizing the problem, is that it's not just, we use the idea of externalities, and that makes the market seem like it's the only thing, and that these externalities are exceptions, whereas the social metabolic metaphor for me is just much more comprehensive about what we really are facing, and taken out of that, that economic viewpoint and framework.
And if we think about, there are crises of reproduction right now for every animal on the planet. Cannot reproduce themselves in the way that they have in the past. And as Naomi Klein points out, that includes humans, that includes people. And I think that's interesting that we don't hear about that in this so-called fertility crisis or whatever. We don't talk about environmental toxins. We don't talk about that we're in a environmental crisis moment as interrupting our reproductive cycles, just like it's interrupting the reproductive cycles of every animal on the planet.
Yeah, and if you think of just the masses of mass migration that's caused by climate change, it's pretty hard to imagine how you'd start planning a family when you're just trying to get over the border wall.
Absolutely.
So you described 3 paths forward, and I love them. The first was market craft, the second is state power, and the third is communism. So about 4 weeks ago, we had Tom Steyer, who was on the forum with us, talking about his new book. And so he was talking about electrovoltaic cells, solar power, wind power, EV vehicles. And he was just saying that the prices of those different things is coming down so substantially that we're just going to naturally adopt those new technologies. But he didn't really help us to... I didn't feel reassured afterwards that that's going to solve the problem. So, why is that not enough for solving our climate problems?
Yeah, there's a great investigator named Brett Christophers who writes exactly about this problem, that we sort of fetishize this number that's called the leveled cost of energy, I believe, LCOE. It says well, if solar panels are so cheap and solar energy is so cheap, then obviously it's just going to beat fossil fuels because fossil fuels won't be able to compete. But if you're a capitalist investing in one of these technologies, you don't want to invest in the thing where the price is going to zero. Right? Why would you invest if I'm going to build a solar farm and they're telling us, oh, the price of solar energy is going to go to nothing in 20 years? Why would I invest in a solar farm? I think of it sort of like the old Yogi Berra saying, no one goes there anymore, it's too crowded. And it's the same thing for investors. They think oh, I'm not going to invest in there, it's way too crowded. They're looking for barriers they can use. And so if the question were just cost of the kind of energy we were looking at, if we could rely on sort of market solutions for that, we'd be home free by now. Like the price of solar energy has been dropping very, very fast for a long time. And if that were what it took, we would be there.
Yeah. Market craft is one of the things that you talk about. How did you decide to talk about capitalism, in that way? And then, what is market craft for us? I think all of us have a sense of for the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of what Biden was trying to do in terms of subsidizing, fields and parts of the economy that are going to contribute to climate well-being. What is market craft, and why did you decide to describe it in that way?
Yeah, it's the term is coined by this political scientist. I think he's at Berkeley, so he's in the neighborhood, named Stephen Vogel. And he uses it to describe a philosophical orientation in which creating the conditions in which market players operate is just as important a role for the government as is statecraft, as is foreign relations. And so with that conception, he's rejecting the idea that the market pre-exists us, or that the market is,
the natural state of human beings,
human's nature. Exactly, like who we are. But it's also not some ancient god we have to appease with everything that we're doing, that we have to sacrifice to or something else. Marketcraft says that markets are a tool that societies of people use to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. And we can use the various tools within the Marketcraft toolbook in order to, for example, decarbonize the economy if that's what we want. So that can include things like subsidies for green energy, but it can also include something like a ban on Bitcoin mining, for example, right? That's a Marketcraft. You can also say, this is not a good use of our resources. This is not a good use of our scarce energy. This is not a good use of our scarce carbon budget at this moment. We're not going to allow that. And that's a kind of market craft as well, as is something like setting up the electronic protocols that charging stations are going to use so that you can always find the nearest, cheapest charging station.
And all the plugs match.
And
which
all
I
the
love
plugs
that. That was
match.
one of my favorite parts of the book. Yeah, and interesting in terms of emissions rules, regulations. And we do see almost like warring market crafts of like regional economies like California and the national economy too.
Absolutely, yeah. Conflicting over standards, but sometimes that means that states like California especially can take a leadership role on these questions and can change the national market from within the regional market. So when California passed a right to repair law around electronics, that changes the electronics market for the whole country, because you're not going to make one set of electronics for California and one set of electronics for everybody else.
I really like that part too. I mean, it's just like a practical, simple thing that makes a huge difference. And everybody knows how frustrating it is to try to work on something that's designed to be like obsolete or designed to like thwart your efforts to fix it.
And we can't afford that these days, right? We don't have the time, we don't have the resources. We got other things to focus on.
Yeah. So I think there's something about market craft that's just, if you're not a market fundamentalist, which is a word that you use and which I think we all could guess what that means. Mm-hmm. If you're not a market fundamentalist, market craft, I mean, it has a kind of a positive connotation.
Sure.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what fears we have that kind of leads us to like be more predisposed to choose market craft kinds of alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, those are the ones that are in front of us, right? We live in a capitalist society, and that is the nearest at hand. One of the examples that I use of a sort of market craft philosophy, and really how market craft is operating philosophically, is the example of Dawn soap, and how they use Dawn soap to clean birds who have been injured in an oil spill. And they use Dawn soap because it's extremely effective. And the reason it's extremely effective is because it's made with petroleum products. And so you're acknowledging that you're part of a cycle, right? That you're using tools that were created by the system and in some ways perpetuate the system in order to clean up the worst, most immediate messes of the system, and that is somewhat contradictory. But there's this great story where the owner of the company, Seventh Generation, the sort of organic or natural soap company, sent a truckload of soap down to try and help the birds, and the rescue workers said, "Sorry, we can't use it." And the interviewer asked them, like, "Why aren't you using this soap?" And the CEO was really complaining, they're destroying the earth by using this lousy soap. And they said, "Look, these birds will try to clean themselves. And if a bird tries to clean the oil off its feathers, it will consume the oil and it will immediately die. Yeah. And so we need to grab the soap that works right now to clean these birds off immediately, or they would die. Not next week, not a soap that we will create at some point in the future, but a soap that works today." And I think market crafters who make that argument with regard to the capitalist system have a point, that tomorrow we are going to live under this system. What tools are we going to use that it has in order to push ourselves in the right direction?
Yeah, I thought you did a great job of making that point. And maybe you could talk a little bit about just why that's not enough. Like, why would we explore other ways of structuring human relations?
Yeah, it would be easy, right? Just
keep doing market
just
craft.
Read the first section and toss the rest of the book.
That's what I was wondering. I mean, maybe it could be a 3-volume work, and the first volume would be this thick, and the second volume.
Yeah, right. No, I try to be really even-handed in the way that I'm looking at these strategies, because I think all three are analytically viable, and they have different things to recommend them, and they fit together in different ways. And so every chapter of these 3 chapters has 5 sections about why it's a good strategy, and then 3 sections about things that it overlooks or vulnerabilities. And I think about that as them as puzzle pieces. And the puzzle pieces, if they were like perfect circles, if they didn't have the like outcroppings and the inlets and the protrusions, then you wouldn't have a puzzle, because they wouldn't lock together. You just have little pieces that sat next to each other. And so it's the unevenness of these strategies that allow for the possibility of them clicking together, I think. They can offer each other different things. And one of the problems with market craft is that you're ultimately reliant on private actors who might just decide not to cooperate, right? You can create the laws, it's true, but they can choose to disobey the laws. And then they can choose to buy politicians who might help them disobey the laws or change the laws. And so there are ways that private actors can themselves, as market fundamentalists, reject even the concept of market craft and say, like, no, you must obey us, or we'll leave the country, we'll take our money and go. Or well, we just won't invest. We won't invest in the green things that you want, and then your economy will stop. People won't have jobs, and then they'll get rid of you and put us back in power. And so there are still tools that these private agents have in a market craft situation, if they're not checked, to undermine our attempt to control the situation.
Yeah, and that was one of the interesting things. There are implicit criticisms of market craft in the later chapters. You just can't get away from it. But there is a way in which money goes to cheap labor, it goes to environmentally destructive processes, and that is in the inherent nature of capital.
Yeah, it chases it. It chases it around the world. The idea that over time economies become less environmentally destructive assumes that things only go in one direction. But investors know that things can go the other direction, like with the example of Shell oil well, right? Like that is an instance of an oil well becoming less environmentally advantageous over time. It can go backwards, if backwards is where you can find the best profit or the best return.
The public power section was the second section, and I want you to talk a little bit about it. In some ways, the market craft and the communism section were so vivid in their descriptions and their accounts, and I had a clearer picture of what those two paths would be like. Talk a little bit about what public power is, and how do we know how do we decide what the public power is? How do we exercise that? It was that was a part that I just wondered about as I was reading the book.
Absolutely. So public power says instead of being reliant on market actors to accomplish what we want, society can do so directly under our own auspices via the state. If we want to build a big dam and capitalists say, I don't really feel like investing in that big dam, no matter how many incentives you give us. And that isn't a theoretical thing, right? In the public power strategy chapter, I talk a lot about pump storage hydropower, which is how we store, both in this country and around the world, almost all grid scale energy.
Yeah, so it's like a battery for electricity for us.
Exactly, but it's made out of two linked reservoirs of water. Like batteries actually store almost no energy, both in this country and the world. Even though capitalists try and tell us a lot about battery technology and how battery technology is improving and we're going to store all this energy in batteries, the reality is we store almost all energy, both in this country and around the world, in these big pools of water that are elevated and lower, which is crazy that you talk even to like climate experts about this and they have no idea. And it's because so much of our discourse is controlled by commercial actors who are more interested in selling us on some particular idea than actually looking at what we need and how it works. And around the world, people are still building all of these facilities constantly. China's building new ones every year. The United States has not built a pump storage hydropower facility in decades. We have not built one this century. And that's because private actors haven't found very good ways to make that pencil out. Making a giant battery out of a mountain with two huge pools of water connected to rivers and stuff is really hard. Yeah. It takes a lot of land. It takes a lot of negotiating. It takes a lot of labor, and these are things that companies would rather not invest in compared to a new battery technology that may or may not work in 5 years, but you might be able to convince someone to invest a lot of money in it because it could potentially scale or whatever. And so public power says, look, the state is going to hire people to build this thing, and we're going to hire people to maintain it, and we're going to do a good job, and we're not going to do it because it's profitable, but we're going to do it because society needs it, because society decides that that's what we want to do. And the best example of this in the United States, because public power is obviously like a pun, right? It's the power of the public to decide what happens, as well as public power, like public utilities, literal electricity owned by and operated by the public. And so the best example that people have probably heard of is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which under the New Deal FDR looked at the South, which was underdeveloped, not just within this country, but as a region in the world, underdeveloped, didn't have electricity, and said, look, if capitalists don't think this is worth investing in, then we'll just do it ourselves. And they created a government agency called the Tennessee Valley Authority that still operates, and they built a ton of structures, and they hired a ton of people, and they continue to operate it into the present day. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has eviscerated this agency. He's removed board members such that they can't get a quorum, and is actively trying to sabotage not just that public power agency, but also the Bonneville Public Power Agency, which is closer out here. But that's the idea for the strategy, is that we can accomplish the things we want, and the workers who will actually be operating these electricity facilities are the ones who both get to decide democratically how we're going to build things, how we're going to use our resources, as well as the conditions under which they're going to operate them, since they're the public themselves.
Yeah, we've had a hard time, I think, just doing large projects like that. I just think of like the New York Times articles about high-speed rail in California from like 2 months ago. I just think the pendulum swings in terms of just your ability to like do massive projects over time.
And they talk about regulation being the threat for high-speed rail, but ultimately, and they say it's too expensive. Well, it's so expensive not because there's not enough steel or not enough workers in the state of California, which is very large labor market. It's that they're private companies that they're relying on as contractors to provide these skills, to provide the materials, to provide the expertise, are holding out. There's not a lot of investment in the private sector that the public can rely on, because we haven't sort of gripped that public power and say, well, we're going to create a new high-speed train agency, and it's going to own and operate and maintain it from the ground up vertically. And if we run into a problem, then we'll stand up some suppliers, right? We'll start our own steel company if we need to. And the idea that we couldn't build high-speed rail in California over the past 15 years is ridiculous. Yeah. It's absurd.
Yeah. I didn't know where to put this question in the whole scheme of things, but this is the AI question, the artificial intelligence question. And I don't know if it fits into the public power section to talk about how we make decisions and understand or process large amounts of information. But how does AI affect, these, your hypothesis, and how does it influence the ideas that are in this book?
I try not to, right?
I know.
It certainly didn't.
It's changed so much. I mean, I just even think the last 3 months. I mean, I wanted to ask you this while we were just hanging out in the green room, but even just to totally dismantle the government, it just seems like AI is a major tool in dismantling the government.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an attack on workers up and down. And when it's interesting, because when we talk about AI, we're not talking about like AlphaFold and the attempt to use like large language models to derive protein structures or something. Like, that's not what we mean. We mean a chatbot that's meant to replace workers. Like, that's what we're talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence. Is not like actually developing the skills that we have as humans in ways that we couldn't do from within our species, using these tools in ways to further ourselves. We're using them to kick ourselves in the face, right? Like, repeatedly to kick ourselves in the face. My hope is that it goes bust like a lot of other bubbles. I really think it's a drag, and it's a drag.
Yeah. Well, thanks. You and I will continue to check in on this matter, because, like I said, I just feel like we're so close to it. I mean,
it's really sacrilegious, isn't it?
Yes.
They really do believe that they are inventing God. That if you connect enough computers, that you sort of derive God, and then if you own God in your computer, and they say this pretty explicitly, and I don't know, man.
Yeah, I preached about AI at Christmas and at Easter, and I think so much changed between the two. But there is a way in which, when you start to describe machines in human terms, like you talk about memory as being like electronic circuits, but you call it memory, it's not long that you go before you start to think of human beings as machines, and that's a...
And some of them are already there. They think we're in a simulation. They think this is a video game, and it shows in how they talk about the climate crisis. They think oh, look, I just found a new lithium deposit. Like, someone put it there for them in a video game. And that is how they think about it. They're like, oh, I got the rings. If you get enough rings, then the problem's solved. And it's not how ecology works.
Yeah, we have the laws of physics that don't relent. So now I want to talk a little bit about communism. I want to talk about, I know, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the history of communism and just kind of where we are now. Like, what examples do you think give us good examples of this kind of way of organizing human beings? What makes it successful?
Absolutely. So communism pre-exists the doctrine of Marxism, the idea that all people are equal and should share in all things in common. I don't have to tell you, is an
Right,
older idea,
exactly.
the community of goods, right?
Yeah.
And so there are plenty of philosophies, including Christianity, that have concepts of communal living, communal existence, and what I call communism. And I do use the term, and which is funny because I'm very careful in the first two sections to pick like non-triggering terms. I didn't want to pick like political ideologies. I wanted people to really like think through the strategy on its own terms without thinking like, oh, that's me or that's not me. And it really fell apart in the third section. But it's because, and I tried like, community, commonizing. I tried these other, softer terms, and I felt like ultimately that was a violation of my implicit agreement with the reader to try and find the best words that I could. And for me, communism means from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, with the acknowledgement in this moment that our collective need is for decarbonization. And what the communist strategy says is that as long as we're thinking about things in terms of value, and we're thinking about that in terms of every individual's ability to make themselves valuable in this system, then we can't think about needs. Because the question, how many shoes does this room full of people need, is not a question about how many feet we have. It's not under capitalism, right? Yeah. That's a question about what we can command in this system each, and then how we want to use our resources as individuals. We can't even assess our collective needs in that way of like how many feet are in this room, and let's make sure everyone has shoes. And that might not be a big problem in a society in which there are enough shoes to go around, but when we're talking about decarbonization, which is an absolute need of every being on the planet, except for some of them that live on silicone or whatever, we can't buy that individually. Right? There's no price. You can't have individual levels of decarbonization that you can buy. And if we can, then we're in even bigger trouble, right? And so we need to insist that this is not something we can buy our way out of, and that if we need to find ways to meet our collective needs, we need a social metabolic order that looks at the world in that way, that doesn't just think about it as a mode of production, but thinks about waste and thinks about reproduction and thinks about needs as a species, so we can start thinking about our needs as human beings as opposed to individuals who can command something on the market.
Yeah. I wonder if you, I love that, because that was a good description of what communism is for you in this book. Could you talk a little bit about just kind of other like-minded people? Like, where are people organizing human life in this way? And, what signs of hope do you see in this way of organizing human beings?
Absolutely. So in this section, I spend a lot of time talking about the 500 million indigenous people who currently live all around the world. And I feel like there's, in our discourse, and in some of the criticism of the book even, people assuming that when you talk about indigenous people, you're talking about like the United States and Canada and Australia. And that's completely false, right? There are indigenous people in every country in the world who are fighting for different social metabolic orders than the dominant capitalist one. And that doesn't mean we can assume that they're all, better than the one we've got. It means we actually have to do some analysis and look at some evidence. And the analysis and the evidence suggests that there are a lot of people out there who are much better at the things that we need to figure out right now, like biodiversity management, like a low-carbon lifestyle, than we have figured out. And that one of the problems with the public power perspective is that it abstracts to this national level and does this sort of SimCity thinking where you just need this much lithium, this much energy, and you can just play with the levels, and you can put all the solar panels in the desert and destroy that whole ecosystem and not worry about what happens there. But that's not how the world works. That's not how it works politically, because people are going to fight you if you try to destroy their desert, because people know that deserts are just as valid ecosystems as any other one. But it also doesn't work ecologically, because that's not how the world is. It's not a video game. It's not a simulation. It's the overlapping and interlacing of innumerable ecological systems and cycles that no person can understand as a whole. but that some people can understand in its particulars, and we can't afford to forsake that knowledge in its particulars. So that's a lot of what I talk about in this chapter.
Yeah, I appreciated that. You mentioned the situation on Kauai with regard to power and water use, and you talked about the fires on Maui. Native Hawaiians have a different perspective on things, and may have a lot more in common with Maori in New Zealand or people in Java, but there really is a kind of a global confederacy of the various different indigenous people, and I was grateful that you saw that and raised that up to our consciousness. Maybe you could talk a little bit about just like the history of your own approach to these ideas. Like, when did you first start thinking, hey, I might be a communist?
That's a good question. I think I was like a left-wing liberal. As a young person, I was very politically involved. I was like a big West Wing fan. I looked up to people like Paul Wellstone, the senator of Minnesota, who was a left-wing firebrand within the Democratic Party. And those were sort of my idols as a young person. But practically, that meant associating with left-wing radicals all the time because I wanted to go protest the wars. Yeah. It started in 2011, or 2001, when I was 12, with the invasion of Afghanistan. I've been against every war that the United States has engaged in since then, and that put me in community with people with much more radical politics than I had, because those were the people who were leading the anti-war movement. And that continued into college, and it wasn't until the financial crisis in 2008, really, when I looked at the stock market crash, and it was clear that either the banks were going to get bailed out, or we were going to have to find out something really different, that we were really going to have to ask some questions about how society worked. And I found myself hoping that the banks didn't get bailed out. I found myself hoping that things wouldn't work out for the system. Yeah. And that had made me ask, well, then what do I really want to happen? What do I really believe in terms of how we should arrange ourselves? And so that led me to think more politically about different histories, different tendencies, and it wasn't until years later that I said, this communist tradition of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs is what I really identify with. But I think that was the moment where I said, look, I'm willing to think about the situation differently, and I don't think I'm alone in that.
Yeah, the Book of Acts has, the first commune. That's exactly it's not exactly that language, but that's where the language
comes. No, the community of goods around Christ is pretty explicit.
Yeah, and upstairs, I wanted to show it to you, but we didn't have a chance. But we have this little sign of this lone figure in the stained glass windows holding a sign that says "Christian Socialists,"
and that's a tradition as well.
Yeah, definitely. Having a child, having a baby, has that changed? How does that change kind of your perspective on political things or human nature? It's such it blew my mind having kids. It totally changed how I looked at so many things, and I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on what it's meant for you.
Yeah. For me, the biggest challenge to my set of beliefs is I really thought kids were born sort of blank slate types.
Yeah, right.
I really thought that personality is something you build over time through your experiences, and I was flabbergasted at the degree to which my son was born with a personality and a consistent personality that he continues to demonstrate day by day, and that threw me for a loop a little bit. It was really exciting, but politically I'm hesitant to claim the authority that comes with being a father.
Yeah, I can understand that,
because I'm not sure being a father necessarily gives you a lot of political insight, right? Donald Trump's a father. There are a lot of fathers out there with really bad politics who act in a way that they don't like. It's as if they don't love their children, and I'm sure some of them don't. But I don't think that's necessarily why they act that way. I'm not sure fathers versus caregivers or even parents have any particular political insights, and I get scary when people try to deploy the authority of their parenthood like that.
Yeah, but by the same token, I think of just exactly what you described as being something you've learned as a parent. And one of the comments you make, I don't know, it's a kind of a peripheral comment to the argument of the book, but that is that there's certain personality types that are going to gravitate to market craft. It's like William James's argument about philosophies, that there's certain people are kind of more likely to be idealistic philosophers, and other people are more likely to be pragmatists. And so I liked that part of it. And that is an important insight too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I talk a little bit about different temperaments and how we find within these strategies patterns of different temperament. And that can be both an asset in that we have this diversity that we can rely on in people's different perspectives, but it can also be an obstruction to working across difference when we are too siloed within these particular personality types.
So one of the aspects that, I love the way you just described it. You're like a little bit, as the book goes on, you're kind of getting more loose about like how you talk about things. But in the third section, the section on communism, you start talking about more about like the enemy. And so it's kind of a rhetorical change. And I wonder, just in the same way that you had to think about, is communism the right thing to call this? What was some of your kind of thought and deliberation when you decided to use language like enemy, that kind of thing?
I think 5 years ago, there was a real coherence among progressives that recognized that the police are the enemy of the people. And they recognized that the authorities are a tool to attack people. And that meant researching lots of history about this country. That meant learning from lots of different people and having discussions about how different communities experience police and the tools that police use to maintain our society. And I think that was one of the most promising moments politically that I've seen in my entire life, was to have those conversations across difference. And whether you were saying, abolish the police or defund the police, these were different political perspectives on what we acknowledged was a collective problem, which is that there are people deputized within our society to hit us over the head depending on where we fall.
Yeah.
And that their job is to divide us and to keep us divided. And I have no problem saying that the police are our enemy. The police are enemies of the people. And I don't think any progressive should have any problem saying that, just as we didn't 5 years ago. And I definitely hold fidelity to that moment of the George Floyd uprising, in which people sacrificed a lot. There are people who are still in jail. And I think in fidelity to that sacrifice, we have to hold on to the insights of that moment.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about the book is just, as we have mass climate migration, how many people are going to be dedicating their lives just to defending borders.
More and more every day.
Yeah.
And more border walls every day. The proliferation of border
That's
walls
what is so interesting to me.
One of the most staggering pieces of research that I found in this book is that, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were almost no border walls in the world. There were a handful, in the entire world, and they've just kept popping up all over the place. And I think there's a real danger that we see the border wall as the tool of the future, that for some people that's not a problem of climate change, that's their solution to climate change, is build higher walls with bigger guns.
Yeah, that was one of the most powerful parts of the books for me. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about China now. So China's an interesting situation, an interesting economy. Could you talk about just what you learned from China with regard to these three paths?
Yeah, it's very funny when we talk about market craft and what country is in the world is the best at this capitalist strategy of designing markets to provide the tools that we need for decarbonization. It's not even close. By any metric, it's not even close. And not even just the productivist metrics of batteries and solar panels, but things like trees. China is far, far away the best country in the world at producing trees and planting trees. There's been an amazing afforestation effort throughout China in a way that the United States absolutely does not talk about. And you ask the average American, is China planting trees? They would have no idea. Yeah. And I think we're at a really dangerous point in terms of xenophobia, in terms of attempts to align us against China. And so one of my goals in this book, which was not a difficult goal at all, you'd have to try hard to avoid it, was to break down the sort of philosophical differences between these systems and to say, well, how is this really operating? How does the Chinese system really operate? And is it actually that different from our system or how we'd like our system to work? And how much of this is trying to frighten people and divide people. And it's worrisome that I don't hear enough voices in the United States, in American politics, saying, I'm not afraid of Chinese people, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not afraid of the country, a billion people in China. They have the same interests that we do. And we have to figure out this planetary problem collectively. Instead, we hear saber rattling, plans for more bomb factories, and that's from both sides of the political aisle.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so pronounced here. I mean, just down the hill from is Chinatown here in San Francisco, and during the pandemic, there was just that anti-Chinese sentiment, which was just all around us, and inflamed by our leaders too.
And normalized within Silicon Valley, increasingly so, despite the crucial role that people of Chinese background and people from China have played in developing the industry over time. Just using xenophobia as a business model, even you hear that from companies like Palantir, that they're trying to start a world war, that their profit model into the future is a world war with China. And we have to recognize that and refuse it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have no idea if you have any insight in this, but you can help all of us if you can help us to understand what happened in the 2024 elections. Like, how do you make sense of that? All of us had that question, right? I can see from our audience.
People can get confused. I mean, one of the nice things I say about not being a liberal is that I don't have to derive some existential truth from the behavior of tens of thousands of people in Pennsylvania. Because I live in Pennsylvania, and I really
You're
don't.
one of them.
Not one of those. But I don't think we'd derive some existential truth about people or the current political situation or even Americans from the voting behavior of a fraction of the 40% of people who show up to vote of enfranchised adults or whatever. It's not, elections don't produce truth for me in that way. So I don't have to throw my arms up and say, well, I guess Donald Trump won, so I guess we got to start deporting people because that's what most people want. I think that's a violation of integrity and even the concept of integrity. But I think people got scared. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened. One was that the Democratic Party refused to distance itself from the genocide in Gaza that is funded and endorsed, and it could not compile a coalition under those situations, under those circumstances. And I don't think we've seen much responsibility from those folks. And not to mention, they also lied about Joe Biden for a long time, really intentionally, about his capacity, his ability to lead. So I don't think people were wrong to be unwilling to vote for Democrats, right? I can't blame them for that. And at the same time, the consequences have been disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, when your son is, 18 years old and going to college and asks what the first 4 months of the second Trump administration were like, what are you going to tell him?
I hope that it will be conditioned by our near-term victory, right? I hope we'll be able to look back and say, that was a threat that we were able to rise to the occasion of, that we were able to answer and able to crush. I hope my son has no memory of Donald Trump. Yeah. And I don't think that's a ridiculous idea, right? I don't think they're going to win. I don't think they can win. Never mind, 1,000-year Trump Reich or whatever. I don't think they can win the next election. They can't make it to 6 months. The whole thing is falling apart, and we're worried that these people are going to rule the world for all time, or they think they're going to. It's not going to happen. So the question is, what strategies are we going to use to beat them? Because we're going to beat them. So the question is, how?
Yeah, it's a great question, because a similar question is for me. What did you think of Eisenhower's politics?
Yeah, right.
I can tell you the broadest outlines of what Truman and Eisenhower alike, but you're right. Time changes and we move on.
Yeah, and hopefully the political situation will have changed so much that we can recall this, that future Americans can recall this as a joke, right? That this was a blip in the history of the world. This was maybe the last set of absurdities before we came to our senses. That's the hope, right? But that takes determination. That takes collective determination. And focused collective determination and coherent collective determination, even across difference. And that's what I'm hoping to do with the book.
Yeah, so this is kind of a counterfactual question, and you can reject the question. But say that you had the manuscript for this book sitting on your desk, and instead of the deadline for delivering the manuscript being last year sometime, what if the manuscript was due on June 1st? Like, how would it be different now, given what we've seen for the last 3 months, than it actually was?
I hope it wouldn't be that different, to be honest, because I hope it's not a reactive book, and I didn't write it as a reactive book. I wrote it as about longer cycles than the American electoral cycles. And yet still I talk about anti-fascism as a cohering point of unity among all three of these strategies. And that's another one where I think we saw what that looked like recently in the first Trump administration, where we had people chasing the alt-right, chasing Nazis out of the public sphere. And that wasn't, tens or dozens of people, as it had been in the past, of hardcore left-wing anti-fascists, anarchists, who had been keeping these people in check before. That was thousands of liberals coming out into the streets of American cities and chasing these people away, right? In Boston in particular, thousands of people flood the streets and says, Nazis won't march in our downtown, and if they try, they're not gonna like what they find. And that's the kind of resistance we need to fascism, right? We need people in the street. We had Congress people talking about, I can't wait to go punch a Nazi, right? And I think we need fidelity to that moment as well, and not say like, oh, well, Donald Trump won the election. I guess it's okay to be a Nazi now. We need a coherent anti-fascism across the left. And if you can't get with that, then you're on the other side. You belong on some other side of the line.
Yeah, there's like a few points where you make that. You make it with regard to gender relations in particular. One of the traditions we have on the forum, which I should have told you earlier, we take questions from the audience. So Rebecca has papers, so you can take questions. I can't tell you. I underlined all the different books that you cited.
Oh man, that's way too much.
Yeah, but I wonder like where you get your news from, and what advice do you have for us as we're trying to figure out what's real, what's true. We've seen so much change in the media landscape, and I wonder if you can kind of let us know how you evaluate what's true and what you take in.
Yeah, I subscribe to like a dozen magazines. I can't read them all, but I do try. And there's something really nice about subscribing to a print magazine, and you can like tear out some pages and fold them up and put them in your pocket, like read them as you go on about your day. And there are a lot of still solid journalistic publications out there, fewer than there were a few years ago, or 2 years ago. But still some. So I encourage people to subscribe to like legitimate news sources. Please don't get your news from TikTok. They're like,
yeah, indeed.
Get people with editors, get people with fact checkers. There are people out there doing earnest work, and I don't really consider myself a journalist these days, but I have a lot of respect for the conventions of American journalism when they're followed. And you can develop a diet of readership as a reader of people you can trust. They are out there. You don't have to throw up your arms and say, like, I give up. I'll just believe whatever my friend tells me or whatever I see on my feed, or not believe anything, right? You can't also lapse into cynicism. But there are facts out there, and you can find them.
How is social media changing now? I mean, there was an article in the newspaper that said that young people are less influenced by social media than they may have been like 7 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how social media is operating these days for young people. I'm only on Twitter. I don't even mess with TikTok or even like visual social media. Yeah, because I'm a word person. And even like podcasts, like they move so slowly. At the end of an hour, I'm like, this could have been a 500-word article. I could have read this in 8 minutes. Yeah. And I do think we need to sort of insist on our own time and our own attention, and that those things are worthwhile, and not look for ways to waste ourselves. Because I think there are a lot of easy ways in which we can waste our time and waste our attention. And we need to like take our time and our attention seriously, like take responsibility for your own attention. If I had one like message for young people, and that's one that I actually heard as a young person from Dr. Cornel West when I went and saw him speak at a lecture. And this is something he really insisted on. It's like, you need to take responsibility for your own attention. And I heard that when I think I was a 16-year-old, and I was like, oh man, like I need to take responsibility for my own attention. And I've taken that as an injunction for my whole life since then, and for better and worse, I guess. But if I had got to talk to young people about how they're getting their information or how they're thinking, that would be the thing I'd tell them is like, that belongs to you. Like, that is you. Take responsibility for your attention and how you're spending it.
I love that. Cornel West was my teacher. I had him for a seminar, and you're right. I've got like a dozen things that are like that in my mind. I hear his words. Yeah, and you're right. Take responsibility for your own attention. Okay, so here's one of the questions that we have. Do you think the ruling class do understand what the effects of climate change are going to be? And that is why we see American aggression toward Greenland and Canada as the permafrost melts and opens up new deposits for resources and shipping lanes?
Yes. I think that's pretty much what they're thinking, even if they're wrong, right? I don't think that's like a very like sophisticated understanding of Greenland that they have. I don't think there really are like a bunch of, again, they have this really video game mentality of like, look, there's a bunch of ore up there. I will use it to build my castle or whatever. And that's not how those things work at all. But I think we see that sort of like return of imperialism, and that's one of the red lines from the 20th century that we've seen fall very quickly in the 21st century, right? We've seen genocide, we've seen imperialism in a way that we thought was past, that some of us thought we were headed in a way to progress out of, and it's clear that that's not the case.
Yeah. You've talked about integrity, but what if there's a feasible path to climate solutions paved with militarized borders? Is reactionary violence like this a poison pill, perfect enemy of the good, etc.?
I don't think there is any such solution that involves border walls, and I reject the idea that we need to protect ourselves from each other across those lines of difference and distinction. I think that's some people's solution. That's certainly a solution for the people inside those border walls for an amount of time. You could make like an air-conditioned compound that runs on the burned corpses of the poor people of the earth, and it could last for a long time. I don't think that's a solution to climate change. I don't think it's a solution to the moment we find ourselves in. And I say from the beginning that I reject partial solutions. I reject the idea that we can't win as the world for the world. That's a basic element of the politics of universality. And not for nothing, one that I think all Christians should share, right? Yeah. That in those politics of universality is something that we need in this moment, and we need to insist on in this moment, at a point when both Republicans and Democrats are fleeing from that idea, to say that, like, maybe we don't need to worry about people who get deported if they're not American citizens. We need to focus on the tariffs. I think that was what the governor of this great state said recently. And that's a betrayal, right? That's a betrayal not just of
human dignity,
but also a betrayal of like liberalism. This is the basic idea that all people are equal, right? And I don't think that's how progressives can win. I don't think progressives are ever going to beat fascists by saying, yeah, we'll build a different wall than the way the fascists are building. I think progressives win by insisting on the universal equality of all people in the face of border walls, right? In the face of border guards, and saying, like, we reject these partial solutions of nationalism.
One of the things we didn't mention, but we've talked so much about your book that we need to say is that, I hope this doesn't spoil it for everybody.
Oh, no.
But you're ultimately you advocate for going down all three paths. So it's not like one path is so superior to the others that it just displaces them. And we just don't know which. We'll learn by doing, and that'll help us to understand, to what extent do we need to go by one path or versus another path. So I just wanted to clarify it. I don't know if
it's not. I'm not looking for. Like I said, it's puzzle pieces. It's not. We're not looking for the key to the lock. And if there were a key to the lock, I think we probably might have found it by now, or like we'd have an idea of it, or people who had the key solution would have demonstrated it at this point. I don't think we know, and I don't think in the realistic time frame that we have, we can expect everyone to unify behind one of these strategies. Right? We're talking about like years. Not maybe a couple decades, not centuries.
Yeah. So here's another question. Thoughts on the Adam Tooze review in the Times and his argument that this is the wrong conversation for the moment. Seems like a myopic take from him that misses the point completely. So you got a friend out there, but asking a tough question.
A myopic take that misses the point completely. Interesting.
I would say that's what he said the review did.
It's an interesting, myopic take that misses the point completely. Interesting.
Do you want me to read it one more time?
So was that a myopic?
You can even hold it while you talk.
I think it's a very emotional time, and a lot of people are trying to figure out where they stand in this moment, and trying to calculate their position in relation to different actors. And that's why I like being a radical communist, is because we don't have to try and shift our position based on, again, what 10,000 people in Pennsylvania might have said. We don't have to go back to the drawing boards or have a deep spiritual crisis about our politics. I think the review was a myopic take that misses the point completely.
Great. Isn't it great? You get a little question and the person provides the answer for you right on the same part.
I don't have to say it. They said it. Whoever in the audience, thanks, Dad.
Right. Can you give us a better idea of what market crafting could look like in the U.S.? And as much as we might like to believe or want a more socialist or communist political economic system, is market crafting the most feasible path forward?
Well, it's definitely the most at hand. I think feasibility also has to look at the problem itself, right? So market craft isn't a feasible solution unless it can actually solve the problem. And my contentions in the book is that there is no single strategy that in isolation can solve these problems. That I just don't believe that's the case. And without even just a recourse to public power, or without the ground up resistance and knowledge that comes from communally organized people, market craft is going to fail. You're going to make mistakes, and it's not going to succeed even on its own terms. So the point of looking at these different strategies wasn't to try and find one that was, or to weigh against the radical against the more near term. It's not like a stages concept from 1, 2, 3 or something like that. It's that there are people doing important work under each one of these strategies right now. And they're going to continue doing that work in the important, relevant period that we're talking about. So the question for the climate movement, and what we will look back from the future and call the victorious climate movement, is how we can find coherence across these lines, not by collapsing behind one of the strategies, right? Not by trying to find some false unity, partly because that's not going to happen, but partly because then we ignore the diversity that comes with the three strategies themselves, which again, we need the puzzle pieces. One puzzle piece can't make a puzzle. Which doesn't mean that people who believe that market craft is the strategy, who are partisans of that strategy, shouldn't pursue that strategy, right? They don't have to find some false unity with people they disagree with fundamentally. Continue, do your market craft strategy, but it has to be in coherence with other people, right? You have to understand what the public power people are telling you, and you have to understand what their points are, and you have to understand where they are and how they're operating, if only so that you can use them to make your strategy work. So that's the kind of coherence that I'm talking about. It's not a false unity behind one of the strategies, but really an awareness of where other people are. And if you look at moments historically of real significant progressive change, that's always how the social forces array themselves. It's always people who have like real fundamental disagreements, even like very analogous to this fundamental set of disagreements through like the French Revolution, through the American Civil War. You have people who disagree, not finding false unity, but finding ways to find coherence across difference.
So here's the next question from the audience. I looked through your book and didn't see any references to degrowth. What do you think of the importance of degrowth? I agree with a lot of Jason Hickel's analysis.
I agree with a lot of Jason Hickel's analysis too, and I think someone who's read his work is going to find a lot of stuff that they agree with, particularly in the communism section, but not just in the communism section, also in the public power section, maybe less in the market craft section, but it's there. The word degrowth does not appear in the book. That's true.
But de-development does occur.
De-development does, but it's a very
thing.
different thing, which is the intentional destruction of society that we're seeing most dramatically in Gaza right now, which is where capital decides that it's easier to destroy and more profitable or a better investment to destroy a place in the world than it is to build industry there. And we're seeing this as a real death-seeking strategy by capital around the world right now, and I think that's partly how we should understand the genocide in Gaza. But I think degrowthers, people who identify with the degrowth ideology, will find a whole lot to like in the communist strategy. But I think focusing on this question of growth can be a bit of a distraction. And I think there are plenty of people who are looking through to find the word degrowth so that they could complain about it. And those people also can't find degrowth in the book, including Adam Tooze, who had to sort of pretend that he could find it in there because it's not in there. And it's not in there, like, not because I'm trying to be tricky, really, but because I think we can approach this from a different angle. And I think communism, for me, is a more useful and accurate term, if not necessarily a less like controversial one than degrowth.
Can you, I can't believe how fast this all happened. I mean, we're basically done now. But could you tell us what signs of hope you see as you kind of look out at the landscape these days?
It's pretty narrow, right?
It is.
It's a dark time. I tell people that I hope that one of the gifts I have for people on the left is that I don't have a depressive personality type.
That's true. It's very true.
And that the depressive personality types are pretty prevalent on the left, and I don't think that's wrong. I think there are a lot of reasons to be depressed, and I think leftists correctly look for a lot of things that are wrong and can find a lot of things that are wrong. But for me, when I see, however narrow a slice of hope we have, that's the one I'll pick up and wield like this and go charging in. And I think that's what we've got to do. We got to say there is no hope for anything but for us. That hope is something we have to seize, and we have no choice but to operate as if we can win. And so then the question is how. And I truly believe that we will win. I truly believe that these partial solutions of fascism, of nationalism, of racism, of sexism are unsustainable, that they ultimately crumble against the truth of the equality of all peoples and all people. And that's on our side, right? The truth is on our side, and that's a truth we have to verify through practice. And I think there are a number of strategies to do it, and I really think we're going to make it happen.
Yeah, I've got to say, part of what we love about you is your hopefulness and your energy and your thoughtfulness. I just haven't read very many books like yours in a long time, and I don't recommend every book that we read for the forum, but I'm very grateful for yours. It was hard work, but it was such a blessing for me to be able to enter your world and see the world from your perspective for a bit.
Well, thank you for chatting with me about it, Malcolm. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Please join us next Wednesday when my guest will be Crystal Williams, president of Rhode Island School of Design. We'll be talking about the power of art in a changing world. I encourage you to buy Malcolm's book.
His book too. Yeah.
My book is not available yet back there. We're focusing on you. So we've got stacks of his book in the back. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give. And thanks again, Malcolm Harris, for joining us tonight. And thank you all for being here.